here I am today. I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the economic consequences of raw bitumen export. And, you know, I have spent the last year and a half now researching this issue, but I really do want to say if it hadn't been for the AFL and the CEP unions, you know, Canadians really have to be thankful because it was your work up, I guess, 6 years ago now, beginning, that really raised the red flag on this and said, you know, the emperor has no clothes. Your initial work with the pipeline applications from Keystone to Keystone XL and now Northern Gateway, well, I really do feel very fortunate to be able to contribute to part of understanding why raw bitumen export is not an energy strategy for Canada and will not benefit Canadians. So I want to be very clear from the beginning about the oil sector in Canada and who is running the show. Because Canada's energy strategy is determined in the boardrooms of a handful of corporations, multinational corporations, and by the governments of foreign countries through their state-owned oil companies. Now, the strategy is actually communicated to the federal and provincial governments through closed-door meetings with lobbyists and at state dinners over desserts in foreign countries. It's supported by legislative changes that reduce environmental protection and reduce public participation. And the multinational oil strategy is forced on the Canadian public through a barrage of misleading narratives and a reliance on misrepresentation of facts, whether it's from pipeline companies, oil sands producers and refiners, their lobby groups, or their bankers. They consistently exaggerate the benefits, they deny the costs, and they underplay the environmental risk. So who are these oil sands companies? 5 multinational oil companies control 78% of current oil sands production. These companies are Suncor, Imperial Oil, whose parent is ExxonMobil, Shell, Canadian Natural Resources, and Cenovus. And then new, primarily state-owned companies, such as Norway's Statoil, and China's Sinopec, PetroChina, and the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company that recently purchased Nexen. These companies have acquired significant oil sands resource development rights so they can join in running the show. So what is Big Oil's plans for us? Well, they want to rapidly extract oil sands heavy crude called bitumen, mix it with imported diluent to allow it to flow down pipelines, and export it as diluted bitumen to the US Gulf Coast along Keystone XL and to Asia along Northern Gateway and Trans Mountain's Twin. Now, this wasn't always the plan. As recently as 2008, multinational oil producers had announced significant investment in upgrading and refining right here in Alberta, and that would have ensured that the oil sector grew right along with the extraction of other raw resources. These projects would have taken Alberta's already strong downstream activity up a notch, stabilized the industry, and securely established a domestic value-added supply chain. In fact, when running for re-election, and we just heard about promises that aren't fulfilled, when running for re-election in 2008, Prime Minister Harper promised that bitumen would not be exported to Asia, but would be upgraded to synthetic crude oil because of the value-added benefits, meaningful job creation, and control over environmental standards that upgrading represents. His government continued to publicly support upgrading oil in Alberta right up until Enbridge filed its application for Northern Gateway. Harper's promises did not concern Big Oil. Exporting raw bitumen is not good for Alberta's value added, and it's not good for the environment. It's only good for a handful of very large companies, and these companies got their way. The negative economic implications of a strategy based on rapid extraction and export of bitumen are staggering. But today, you won't hear anything about the economic costs from ministers of the Government of Canada who, instead of protecting the public interest, have become marketing executives for the oil sector. You won't read anything about the extensive economic costs of the oil sector's plans from banks and financial analysts pursuing their own narrow self-interest. The manipulative spin and blatant propaganda to force these bitumen export pipelines through has become palpable. I'm going to review a number of key economic consequences of the oil sands bitumen export strategy and how it will ruin the Canadian economy. To put it simply, when it comes to non-renewable resources, the rapid extraction and export of raw bitumen is not economic development any more than watching a cannibal eat with a knife and fork is progress. You know, development means enhancement. Development means value added and improvement, making our lives better. Some form of contributing to a better state because of the economic activity. And so, you know, there are essentially two things you can do with bitumen once it comes out of the ground. Upgrade it to synthetic crude oil, SCO, so it can be processed in a refinery and become petroleum products like gasoline and jet fuel. And if we do all that here at home, we get all the value. Or you can dilute bitumen with a substance like imported condensate to enable it to move down a pipeline for upgrading and refining in foreign markets. This is not development, this is exploitation. The oil, thank you, Gil. No, the oil sector's strategy is exploitation. They plan to rapidly extract and export raw bitumen, or to borrow Gil's more powerful phrase, rip it and ship it. Ripping and shipping bitumen will deliver a worsened economic, social, environmental, and cultural reality for Alberta and for all of Canada. And that's not anti-business or anti-development. That is just the truth. It's a fact. So, what is the first severe side effect of the oil sector's self-serving strategy? It's the impact on oil prices in the Canadian economy. It's what their plans mean for prices paid by Canadian consumers and businesses for petroleum products. You know, for almost 2 years, Enbridge told us the benefits from Northern Gateway would come from higher prices paid in Asia for our oil. Pipeline proponents and elected leaders like Minister of Natural Resources Joe Oliver told us this would contribute economic benefits to Canada. What they didn't tell us, and what my evidence filed through the AFL to the National Energy Board last year disclosed, was that they plan to apply higher Asian prices on every barrel produced and sold in Canada every year. Not for 1 year or 5 years, but higher prices for our products every year for 30 years because the pipeline is built. When refineries pay higher prices for their feedstock, they pass these price increases on. That's the primary purpose behind accessing new markets. Get the highest price possible for 1 barrel and pass it on to all barrels that you produce. And we all know that higher oil prices mean a decrease in family purchasing power. And as families try to adjust, they cut back on spending or go deeper into debt. We also know that when businesses face higher energy costs, they cut back in other areas, like wages, or postpone investment, leading to slower growth, and then they resort to downsizing and layoffs. So whenever you are told access to foreign markets secures higher prices for our crude and this benefits Canada, you also need to know oil producers plan to charge those higher prices on every barrel they produce. And when they do, their refineries pass it right on to us here at home. So the new market access Canadians need for Canadian crude is getting it to Eastern Canadian refineries. That's a demand of about 750,000 barrels a day. Quebec and the Atlantic provinces are almost completely dependent on foreign crude oil imports from volatile and uncertain markets, the same markets we are told China is trying to protect itself from by importing our crude. These refineries in Eastern Canada already pay higher prices for their imports because they are priced off the international benchmark called Brent. But most Canadian refineries, especially in Eastern Canada, cannot process oil sands bitumen. This means it has to be upgraded in Alberta to synthetic crude oil, to SCO. Now, I know that TransCanada has just entered into an open season to see if oil producers want to ship oil by pipeline from Alberta to the Atlantic Canada. But if this is a bitumen export pipeline, it presents the same problems as Northern Gateway, Trans Mountain's Twin, and Keystone XL. If diluted bitumen is shipped eastward, it is only intended for export. TransCanada's pipeline proposal becomes just another escape route out of Canada for oil companies so they can avoid upgrading bitumen in Canada, ship your jobs, and meaningful environmental control. So unless Canadian energy self-sufficiency is a stated government policy and bitumen is upgraded in Alberta first, Big Oil's plans will just continue to cannibalize our economy. Now, traditionally, Alberta upgraded about 60% of the bitumen pulled out of the ground. In 2007, the Alberta government promised the rate would be 72%, bringing with it the benefits of value-added, meaningful jobs, and greater tax revenue. Then came the financial crisis, and the upgrading projects were scrapped in Canada. In the US, investments in upgrading and refining were made, including investments made by Canadian oil producers such as Cenovus, Husky, and French multinational Total. These investments were made to accept Canada's bitumen. So instead of a Canadian upgrader, we get Keystone XL, a bitumen export pipeline to the United States. As this graph explains, Big Oil's decisions to enhance refineries in the US to accept our bitumen and the plan to do the same in Asia has already started to hollow out Alberta's resource sector. The percentage of bitumen upgraded in the province has begun to decline and will continue to do so if raw bitumen export pipelines are built. Now, when bitumen isn't upgraded but intended for export, it requires diluent in order for it to flow down a pipeline. Because it's so thick, it will not move on its own. The diluent of choice to get bitumen to move is condensate. Now, up until 2005, Canada was self-sufficient in condensate production. When we produced a barrel of bitumen and mixed it with domestically produced condensate to make diluted bitumen, we exported a barrel of diluted bitumen, or dilbit for short. Now, that's not true anymore. By 2006, condensate demand began exceeding domestic supply, and oil producers started importing it from the US. The rapid extraction and export of bitumen requires a growing import dependency on condensate, as this slide clearly represents. And to import condensate, you need pipelines. That's why Enbridge reversed its Southern Lights oil export pipeline in 2010 to import condensate. And then they had to build an oil export pipeline. That's why Kinder Morgan is reversing its Cochin pipeline to flow from Illinois in the US to Alberta. Currently, we export propane down that pipeline. The need for more condensate import pipelines is why Enbridge's Northern Gateway project includes a twin pipeline, one dedicated to import condensate from the Middle East. So this strategy is, this export strategy is camouflaging an import dependency strategy. But the untold real clincher with Big Oil's strategy is if growing reliance on imports from the Middle East is not enough. In order to export dilbit instead of upgrading bitumen in Alberta, more than twice the pipeline capacity is required. Why twice? Well, You need the pipeline to bring the condensate in, and when you mix it with bitumen at a ratio of 30% condensate to 70% bitumen, you need the same amount of pipeline capacity to export the condensate back out. And because dilbit is denser than upgraded or conventional oil, it moves slower. So before we know it, twice the pipeline capacity is required to transport a barrel of dilbit than when bitumen is upgraded in Alberta to SCO. Twice the pipelines, twice the transportation costs, more than twice the environmental risk, and in the end, less than a third of the value captured here in Canada for our resources. So in summary, the top 7 economic costs of the oil sector's bitumen export strategy that none of us can afford are decades of higher oil prices for Canadian consumers and businesses across the country. Lost opportunity to add value, create meaningful jobs, and control environmental standards here at home. Number 3, hollowing out of the oil sector as raw bitumen exports take precedence over upgrading and refining. Number 4 is a continued reliance on foreign oil imports through Eastern Canada. And number 5 is a growing dependence on foreign condensate imports through Western Canada. Number 6 is twice the number of pipelines and double the tanker traffic to move diluted bitumen as compared to upgraded bitumen. And number 7, more than twice the environmental risk and all their related costs. Big Oil's corporate rapid extraction and export strategy makes no economic sense. And I look forward to the labor alternative Gil will present in a minute, because we need to develop an energy policy in Canada, made in Canada, for and by Canadians. This is not what Big Oil wants, but it's what our country needs. So we need to keep saying no to raw bitumen export that robs Alberta of meaningful jobs, resource development, and control over your environmental standards. And we need to say no to condensate imports that create a dangerous dependency on high-cost diluent from foreign markets. And when we say no, what we are really doing is we are saying yes. We are saying yes to a better economic and environmental future for Alberta, for Canada, and for all Canadians. Thank you very much.